Everyone. I'm really happy to be here because I thought the webinar started at 10:30, and I was just chatting with Lindsay before this all started, and she said, we should probably log in soon. I said, well, we don't start until 10:30, and she said, no, I'm pretty sure it's at 10. In my calendar, it says 10:30, so I'm glad I'm here. Anyway, welcome. I'm Fostaty Young. I'm the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. And it's unusual that I would be doing a webinar because I've gotten out of the habit of doing workshops. Anyway, as we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I am situated right now on the traditional and unceded lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people. And it took me a while to get to the point where I felt comfortable doing the land acknowledgement, because I felt that it was tragic that we were on unceded territories, and I want to express appreciation for being able to be here, to appreciate that we are here and that we're able to work together. I took some time this morning to go outside and enjoy the moist, warm air. And I'm hoping that after we do that today, the sun will be shining and we'll all be able to go out and do that. We have over 70 people who are joining us this morning from West Campus, East Campus, and European Campus at the Bader International Center. And we have representation across all the disciplines. That being the case, I think I should let you know what this webinar is going to be about and what it's not going to be about. I'm going to be sharing a few ways of orienting your approach to assessment in ways that help focus your students' attention on meaningful learning. I'm going to be sharing some specific strategies and frameworks with you that you might consider. And everything that I'm going to be sharing with you is adaptable across disciplines. Then I'm going to invite you to share some of the techniques that you've been using in your own teaching practice. Now, what the session isn't about is how to do this in on cue. There won't be any buttonology involved in what we're going to be talking about today, but rest assured that everything we are going to be talking about can be done in on cue. So I encourage you, if you have technological questions about what we talk about, drop into some of the virtual on cue drop-ins on Thursday, or check out the series that we have. We have an on-cue webinar series, and some of the sessions deal specifically with assessment. So the other thing is that we are encouraging everybody to adopt alternatives to holding a proctored final exam. Not only because they're difficult, expensive, and not terribly accessible for those students who don't have good internet access, but pedagogically, often the techniques that we're going to be talking about are pedagogically more sound. I'd like to let you know that Lindsay is going to be assisting me here. She's going to be monitoring the chat because we've discovered that the presenter can't see the chat when they're sharing their screen. And I'd like to be able to address any questions that you have as they come up. So Lindsay is going to gently let me know when I should stop talking and address some of the questions that you're typing into the chat. And she's also here for moral support because I've never done a webinar before. So on that note, oh, and Lindsay, Sandra wants you to make sure that I leave a couple of minutes at the end so people can give some feedback on how things went.
Great,
okay?
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the time too.
Okay, good. Keep me in line. So let's get started. With that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'm going to start sharing my screen.
I did see it there, Sue.
And then so did I, and then it disappeared.
There you go.
There I go. There. All right. I want you to have a look at the date that this quote comes from, 1990. It's a long time ago. And it simply states that what and how students choose to learn is in large part influenced by what and how we choose to assess. And the fact of the matter, it's not in large part, it is almost always the guiding influence on how students spend time in our course. They interpret things like what a 20% midterm exam means, or what a 20% 10-page assignment means. And they will allot time and focus to what they interpret those things mean. Consider yourself. So consider how you might prepare if I told you there was going to be a true-false quiz at the end of this webinar, or if I told you that we're going to have an analytic case study related to the content. You would very definitely spend your time differently and focus on different things and the different content that we're going to be covering. I had the opportunity to speak to a third year Western student toward the end of last term, when everything was moving to remote delivery and a lot of people were switching up from a proctored final exam to a take-home exam or a paper. And he was a little upset because he said, now I actually have to go in and understand the material. And before, all I had to do was remember the material. So he had taken cues from the fact that they were going to have a multiple choice final exam, that he didn't feel that he actually had to understand the material being presented. So consider that as we move forward. There's been an awful lot of research lately and in the past about what assessment needs to look like to support learning. So here we have the first 3 points: provide ample opportunity for engagement with course material, ensure that students allocate appropriate time with the material and the degree of their engagement with it, and that they engage in productive learning, not like the student who was memorizing rather than understanding course material. And the last point is about including communication so that we communicate to our students about what's expected. We're going to be talking primarily about the first 3 and talking about a framework about how we can help our students focus their attention on what's important. I have a bit of a short exercise that I want to put you through as an illustration of what we're going to be spending our time talking about. Some of you may already have seen it, but I think it's an important point to consider. So I'm going to present you with a list of 12 words, and I'm going to give you 20 seconds to count the number of vowels in the word list. Ready? Here we go. Count the vowels, please. Thank you. So does everybody have a vowel count? Now I'd like you to list as many words as possible that were on that list. I'll give you 20 seconds for that as well. All right, here's the word list. I'm going to pop out of my screen here. So that we can talk about this for a little bit. How did you feel when I asked you to do one thing and report back on another? What's coming up in the chat, Lindsay?
Yeah, so people are commenting great exercise, and it shows like very few recalled the actual names of what words came up. For me, I found it just illustrates how important the assessment is tied to the knowledge, because I got like 27 for vowel count and then only 2 words that I could recall. Which is hilarious because I was so focused on the vowels I didn't read the words. And that's so important, especially online, because students will skim. They will just do what is required of them. And if you're not explicit in what you want them to do, they'll miss the other stuff. And that happens all the time, but it happens even more in online learning.
Yeah, and it's interesting because sometimes we ask our students through the way that we do assessment to focus on the minutia or the wrong things. And think about the student that I told you about having to alter his approach to his studying and how he was going to prepare for the final exam because he had been spending time on minutia. Now, sometimes we do things the opposite way as well. We'll teach concepts in class and ask students to make connections, be able to problem solve, create hypotheses, and then we give them final exams that are based on facts, recall, and the disconnect there confuses them and doesn't allow them to demonstrate exactly what it is that they've learned.
Yeah, there's some great comments coming in the chat too about, from the student perspective, how frustrating that is and how it feels like a trick question. It feels like they're ill-equipped to answer it. And then someone commented, Bob, thanks for that. Surprises are for birthdays, not for assessment evaluation. I think that's so good.
Sounds like we have a lot of people who are already cognizant of this and who are already making inroads to make sure it doesn't happen. All right, I'm going to pop back into the presentation, if I can find it again. Here we go. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the details around creating an aligned and transparent assessment plan. This comes from a variety of sources, and this is just sort of condensed. So we're going to be talking about ways to ensure that the real important meaty parts of your curriculum and the frame of learning are adequately represented. And when I'm talking about the frame of learning, I'm talking about the different ways there are of being right and the level of complexity of the learning that you want. In the example that we just had, we had 2 different levels of complexity. And they were misaligned in terms of what it was that I wanted you to attend to. We're going to talk about ways to articulate purpose and the relevance of each of the assessments that you have. And we're also going to talk about the importance of using a variety of assessment techniques and offering students options wherever possible. When you think about the variety of assessment techniques, we'll come to appreciate there are different techniques for different frames of learning, and not all assessment techniques do as good a job in each frame of learning as others do. So we'll talk about which ones are best for each frame of learning and how to tweak some of them so that you can raise the ante, so to speak, of the way that you use those. We're also going to talk a little bit about the ways to offer students options when it's possible to do so. And when you take a look at two of those things, articulating the purpose and elevating the relevance of your assessment, and offering student options, for those of you who are exploring ways to adopt more Indigenous approaches to your classes and the ways you assess, those two bullet points are very closely aligned with Indigenous ways of Indigenous pedagogies, the relevance and the options to increase relevance and meaning making. Lindsay, do you want to jump in here at all?
Yeah, I think definitely it lends itself to Indigenous ways of knowing, offering time for reflection, offering time for creativity and engagement with prior knowledge. It's also good for mature students who are coming back to academic environments. Maybe they've been away from school for a while. It's great for career preparation because you can focus your assessments on something that they will practically be doing on the job. So there's many ways that it's relevant, but definitely you can infuse Indigenous ways of knowing quite easily into those two areas.
And the last bullet point there, we're going to talk a little bit about ways to ensure that your grade weighting reflects the level of engagement for students, the time they spend on what they're doing, and the time they spend in the frame of learning that you're hoping that they're going to attend to. Now, for those of you who know me well, and I know that there are some of you in here, you're not getting away with it. I am going to have to talk about ICE, so get ready for the ride. For those of you who don't know me, I am a proponent of the ICE model. ICE it's an acronym for Ideas, Connections, and Extensions. And I've come to appreciate it as a way of explaining to my students that there are at least 3 different ways of being right. You can be right at ideas, you can be right in connections, and you can be right in extensions. And the important thing is to answer questions in the frame they were posed. So ideas are the nuts and bolts of learning. So they are anything that you can look up in your notes, anything that you can look up in a book. They are steps in a sequence or a process. So if you think about history, for example, being able to recite names, dates, and places is a representative of the frame of ideas in history. In something like math, it might be being able to do plug and chug problems that you just know what numbers go where. In something that is more physical skills based, like something like basketball, it's knowing the rules of the game and being able to execute discrete skills like running or dribbling. So some of the words associated with ideas when you're creating assessments would be to ask students to do things like define, cite, list, label, anything that is replicating or iteration. The next frame of learning are connections. And connections are of two kinds. There are the connections that students are able to articulate among the different ideas in a course. And there are connections that students are able to make based on what they already know. So going back to the examples we used in history, when students can articulate the relationship between events in historical perspective, they're articulating connections. When they're able to do things like understand their family's emigration patterns as in relation to historical events, they're making those meaning-making connections. In math, when students are able to select the appropriate equation for a problem, they're making the connection between those two things. And in basketball, when you can combine two things like being able to dribble and run at the same time, you're making a connection, integrating two things smoothly into one. Now, as I'm talking about ideas, connections, and extensions, I'm hoping that you're thinking about your own courses that you're currently teaching and what some of the ideas are that you want students to be able to focus on and what some of the connections are that you want students to be able to make. And it's important that you consider that it's the students who are making the connections. It's not you telling the students what the connections are. It's you providing opportunities for them to discover those connections. So some of the verbs that you might think of when you're thinking about connections are asking students to do things like apply, adapt, differentiate, translate. You can see that all those verbs implicate some kind of a connection or some kind of a relationship. Now, extensions are what a lot of faculty members I work with describe extensions as the aha of learning. It's when students understand the implications of what they've just learned outside the confines of the classroom. So, for example, when in math, if a student suddenly becomes able to start to create an equation to be able to represent something that they see in the world, they're making an extension. In history, if students can become able to anticipate world events based on what they know, they're making extensions. In basketball, when you're able to anticipate the play and make a blind pass to where you know that a player will eventually end up, that's an extension. So it's learning demonstrated in a novel context. Let's put it that way.
That's great. I also highlighted to you in the chat, Sue, that this is a great alternative to Bloom's taxonomy for coming up with the proper verbs for your learning outcomes. Often I come across a lot of people using the word understand, which is not measurable. It's not, how can you measure understanding that's so different from student to student? So some of these alternatives that you've provided in the ICE model are very good words to use instead of understand.
Yeah, they're more, you're better able to discern for yourself what your target is, and your students are able to understand what your target is. And when they can understand that, here we are using the word understand when we just said it's not a very good word to use. You can start to plan for your own learning. If students know, for example, that they're going to be asked to define things or list and label, that will give them a cue as to how they interact with the course material, which is a completely different way if they've been told that they're going to be invited to defend a position. Now, it's important to recognize that we're not placing a value on ideas, connections, and extensions. And we're not always aiming for students to make extensions. What we're doing here is being able as instructors to articulate our intentions for the frame of learning we want our students to engage in. Some of you may have had students who come to you during office hours and say things to you like, everything in my paper is right. Why didn't I get an A? And the fact of the matter is that maybe everything in their paper was right, but you want them to be more than just right. You want them to do something with the ideas that they have in their paper. And perhaps the intention was for them to make connections between those ideas and what was discussed in class. Without knowing what the purpose of the assessment was, some students will just write down every single thing they know, hoping that something will be right. So, using ICE or any other model of assessment or learning, it doesn't have to be ICE, but I encourage you to find something that works for you. Bloom's taxonomy, solo taxonomy, anything, just as long as you will be able to articulate your intentions and share those intentions with your students. So now I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can use when you're targeting the frames of ideas, connections, and extensions. And one of the reasons I'm sharing this is because as an educational developer, I'm often told by instructors that their primary purpose as an instructor is to help their students think like a chemist or think like a geographer. And yet, often the activities we ask students to engage in don't afford them that possibility. So, ideas. Multiple choice quizzes are great for checking students' ideas. And they're also very easy to create to check on ideas. And all the things listed there, true false quizzes, fact-based quizzes, Jeopardy, even reports that are just asking students for finding facts and reporting those back. And things like recipe-based labs where students are given a set of steps and they just go through it like a recipe to reach a foregone conclusion. And we've already mentioned plug and chug problems. Now, there is nothing wrong with any of these things. They all serve a really wonderful purpose. Some of these tools are limited as to the frames that they can invite demonstrations at. If you take a look at true, false, and uncertain, there was a doctoral student who was teaching an economics course, and she decided that what she was going to do was up the ante in her true false quizzes that she gave students. If students answered a statement as true, they could just leave it at that. If they answered that the statement was false, she wanted to know what changes would need to be made for the statement to be considered true. If they were uncertain, they had to write in what pieces of information were missing that prevented them from making a decision about its truth or falsehood. So she upped the ante of that. So when students were getting ready to write her quizzes, and she used true, false, uncertain a lot, she actually helped them engage with the material on a deeper level, at least the more cognitively complex level. You can see too that everything in the connections list invites students to be able to do things like meaning make. So this is where the real learning happens, and this is where learning starts to become more permanent. Because once students understand how things are connected and they can chunk information in that way, it becomes longer lasting. We're going to be talking a little bit more about these kinds of things, but I wanted to know how people are feeling about this kind of division of what things are good for and what they might be better used for.
Yeah, so if you want to jump into the chat with some thoughts and then I can share them to Sue. I have a couple of initial thoughts, Sue. I think this is a great way to visualize what types of assessments you could have, and when you're choosing those verbs, you're choosing them so your students have direction, but you're also, it enables you, like you said, to think about what kinds of assessments you could use to define or to use all those different verbs. So for me too, I would add in under ideas is where I generally do sharing circles. That's where we generate ideas in my courses. We talk about the ideas, and then a lot of my assessments would fall under connections and extensions. So I have under connections, I have them do think, pair, share activities. That's for both ideas and connections. And then I have them do reflective journals, which is connections, but often it goes into extensions because they're making connections to their own context personally, but then also they might bring that outside and say, this is how I would further extend upon this when I'm a professional psychologist or a business person. This is how I could extend upon that when I'm in the field. So some of those assessments really do work on multiple levels, but like you said, you don't have to hit all three. So that's nice too.
Right. And I think it's important to recognize that as you structure assessment throughout the term, there will be times when it makes perfect sense to focus on ideas. There will be times when it's really important to ask students to start making connections. And you might choose, after helping students understand how to make extensions and practice doing those in class, to save those as an integrative process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move on.
There's a few questions coming in, Sue. So one is, as Sean pointed out, that it is kind of level dependent as well. So maybe first years might not be at the level of connections or extensions right away, but you can kind of build towards that. And then someone had asked a little bit of trouble distinguishing between connections and extensions. I don't know what we just covered talks about that or clears that up a bit, but if you could speak to that, Sue.
Yeah, I'm glad that someone's brought up the notion of level. And what I want you to consider is that ideas, connections, and extensions happen from kindergarten up to right now in PhD programs and beyond. And I'd like you to consider that ideas, connections, and extensions are qualitatively different in first year than they are in fourth year. I think that it's really important to consider this. I heard a first year PhD student talking to her supervisor. She was very nervous, saying that, you know, she was a PhD student and she was really nervous about being able to perform at that level. And his response to her was, but you just completed a master's and you were a fabulous master's student. And she said, yes, she said, I was an expert master's student and now I am a novice PhD student. And I think that that summarizes really well what happens in first year. It's important that students collect new ideas, and it's important that they build connections among those ideas so that when they get to second year, some of those connections become so deeply integrated that they become second year ideas. They become the givens of second year. So I'd like you to think of ICE and ideas, connections, and extensions as infinitely recursive and qualitatively different depending on your developmental state. Now, the difference between connections and extensions is one of novelty. So when students are making connections to what is known, to something else that is known, those are connections. But when students understand the implications of those connections for something they have never encountered before and are able to do things like predict and hypothesize into the unknown, that's an extension. Does that make sense to the person who asked that question?
I'll let her respond or give her a chance to respond. If you can let us know, Heather, if that answers. I think that was great, Sue, too, and it speaks to the desire to really set high expectations for students and let them know that they're capable of all three of these levels right in first year, and don't be afraid to like give them too much or think that it's more than they're capable of. I think the higher expectations are, but the clearer the instructions and the clearer the assessment and the alignment between the learning outcomes and the assessment is, the more confidence those students will have, and they will rise up to the level that you expect them and beyond if you're very clear and you set those high standards right away.
Yeah. I want to share another way of using this, and it's about setting the right exam. Not very many people use tables of specifications, and this is what's called a table of specifications. Often we will tell students that on the exam, and this comes from business, but the content can be filled in with whatever subject area you happen to be teaching in. We will often tell students what elements will be on an exam. So here we have privatization, mergers and acquisitions, gender discrimination, and ethics. And then we will often tell students that privatization will be worth 20 marks, mergers and acquisitions, 20 marks. So the students will know that that is what the exam is comprised of. However, it still doesn't give them or us a really good idea of what the exam is really about. But if we decide in our own minds beforehand, like at the beginning of term, that what we really want students to focus on are ideas, connections, and extensions, and the way that they're going to be showing up on the exam. So this is for those of you who are going to be creating quizzes, exams, whatever. If you know, for example, that you really want your students to know legal aspects or what are in statutes around gender discrimination, for example, you might choose to focus a lot of the point values for gender discrimination in the ideas frame. It might be that you want students to be able to analyze a case. So you're going to allot the marks for ethics at the extensions. You're going to invite students to make extensions. I choose those words very deliberately because we can invite students to make extensions, but they might answer the question at ideas or connections. We might invite students to make connections, by asking a question that starts off, what is the relationship between X and Y? And what they will do is identify the characteristics of X and the characteristics of Y, but not articulate the relationship. So we can't say that the question is a connections question. What we can say is that the question invites connections. So
I think that's great, Sue. It's like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you
yeah,
can't force them to drink, especially not your drink of choice. They could choose another
that's true.
drink. But anyway, Kathleen had a good point too, or something that she liked to share that she does, and it's she helps students to understand ICE by discussing a rubric in relation to a completed sample assignment. So that's really just taking it a step above and beyond and giving them additional preparation for how they can best prepare or study for a certain assessment.
Yeah, and I think that using a rubric is a really great idea for assignments. And one of the things that I've done is, instead of giving a sample assignment to the students that is sort of the premium quality A assignment and having them have the rubric, I've discovered kind of by accident that giving students an assignment that is probably worth a C, but with annotations about how the student could have improved it in relation to what the rubric says, is far more instructive to them than seeing a really well-crafted assignment. So take that for what it's worth. I discovered that by accident, so I thought I would share that with you. So the other thing about using a table of specifications is that a lot of us end up having to make multiple versions of the same assessment for students who don't make it to the first one, or if you are having a final exam, you want to have multiple versions. And using a table of specifications ensures that you actually have equivalent exams. So that not only are the topics the same, but the level of complexity of the questions are equivalent across different versions. So take that for what it's worth. Some people have even started blueprinting their entire assessment. So they'll have their learning outcomes listed, and they will have their assessments across the top, and each column divided into ideas, connections, and extensions, just to see where the focus is. And a lot of people, when they do that, they discover that they're actually not pitching the course at the level they thought they were pitching the course. So it's worth giving it a whirl just to see if you're really doing what you think you're doing. Now, part of the transparent assessment design is making sure that students understand the purpose, the relevance, and the criteria for assessment. There's another body of research by Rust, Price, and O'Donovan that has clearly articulated that when students are aware of the purpose of the assessment and they know what the criteria are for success, their learning achievement goes up. And what Winklemas discovered is that when students perceive some kind of relevance to the assessment, their achievement goes up. Now, we're talking about learning achievement, which doesn't only mean marks. It means learning that lasts. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these, and I'm going to encourage you to think about what these might look like in your own classes.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes remaining total, Sue.
Thanks. It's really important that students know what knowledge or skills they're going to get from completing an assignment. I always find it useful to let them know which learning outcomes are being targeted And sometimes when I say, this is the purpose of the assignment, these are the 2 learning outcomes that you should be able to address. And I have said to students that if you don't think you're going to be able to demonstrate those 2 learning outcomes in this way, please let me know how you think you will be able to demonstrate those learning outcomes. And if we all agree, it then becomes an option for everybody else in the class as well. Doing things like that actually increases the relevance of the activity to the students and helps them with the meaning making. Now, you presumably already have the criteria for success through a rubric, and as long as those suggestions will allow you to see that success through your rubric, you're golden. I just have 2 sample statements here for you to consider. This first one is from calculus, and all it says is that this assignment has been designed to encourage the improvement of your mathematical writing skills, invite you to explain your mathematical thinking, and demonstrate your proficiency with applications of the derivative. So students actually know how they're supposed to be engaging with this. And then you can increase this by talking about the relevance of that. Maybe it's going to be relevant to the course they're taking next. Maybe it's going to be relevant because they're in engineering and they're going to have to be able to explain their thinking to clients. Notice too that this isn't just about problem solving, it's inviting students to explain their thinking. Now, if we really want students to think like a chemist or think like a geographer or think like something else, these are the types of activities we should be inviting them to. And less people in humanities and social sciences feel left out. Here's another purpose and relevance statement. This one is asking students to complete an annotated bibliography, and it tells them that it's because you want them to become familiar with discipline-based literature, and it tells them that you want them to describe how what they're reading for the bibliography relates to complements or refutes what they've covered in class. So it spells out to students that you don't just want them to summarize 7 articles, you want them to do something with it. If you don't currently have purpose and relevance statements, I want you to think about how easy or difficult it would be. And I ask you that question because it requires that we actually know why we're asking students to do what we're asking them to do. Sometimes some of the things we're asking students to do seem like a good idea at the time, but I think we need to be able to relate those to how they match our learning outcomes. Okay. I'm going to share a couple of meaningful ways of getting your students to engage meaningfully with course materials, and then I'd like to hear from you. There are a couple of people on campus who ask their students the question of the day at the end of every one of their sessions. They tell me that it keeps them honest. So it's that this is the kind of question I want my students to be able to answer at the end of my session. And they're usually not based in facts. They're usually based on what do I want you to be able to do as a result of having spent this time with me today. And some of the people who use questions of the day don't answer the questions for their students the next day. And I've interviewed some of the students who participate in courses like this and asked them if they find it frustrating. And they said, no, it doesn't. What it really does as it helps them understand what they really need to focus on in their study groups. The next one, called Tell Me Tuesday, it comes from somebody at the School of Business who they met on Tuesdays. So she encourages her students to come to class prepared to talk about things they've seen in advertising that related to the concepts from the previous course. So she's asking her students to go out and find things related. She's asking them to make connections and bring them back to class and share them with people. She actually awards her participation grades as a result of Tell Me Tuesdays. And the tort walk from the law is something similar. A prof had asked his students that on their way to class or on their walks, incessant walks around the block because they can't go to class, to take pictures with their cell phones of tort waiting to happen. So students will upload pictures to their course site of construction workers not wearing their helmets, of students walking beside the sidewalk instead of on the sidewalk, and uploading little statements about their interpretations of what they see. You can tell by some of these that this is going to mean that you might choose to use your TAs or your learning facilitators in different ways if you're going to be doing things like this. Now I want to hear from you about some of the things that you do with your students to help them focus on the meaningful parts of your course.
Yeah, so there was a comment, an example of a question of the day. So what would an example be? I've used, if you're not sure of the question, have the students pose a question. Sometimes that's helpful too if you have the capacity or TA help to do that. I've called those exit tickets and have the students fill out just a sheet of paper before they're able to leave the class, like stand at the door and collect them. Don't let them leave until you get them. But have them say what was the muddiest point for them or a question that remains at the end of your lecture or your session with them, so that you're have an understanding of where they might be a little bit confused or need further clarification on things, but they might also be able to pose a question at that point to you that you could then address in another lecture or in a different way or some kind of other format.
So some of the questions from the question of the day from the profs who I was working with were things like, they were related to the content of the course but hadn't been covered in the course. So they would be things like, given what you know about the writings of this author and this author, how do you anticipate they would deal with, and then a question. So it causes the students to reflect back on what they learned about each of those two authors and then anticipate what that dialogue would be like. You could do that similarly in one of the sciences if you were just teaching students about properties of things and then asking them to anticipate reactions.
Nice. So there's lots of good ideas coming in too. So hashtag this, have students summarize their learning using a series of hashtags. An example is hashtag ICE is a great for meaningful assessment. So thanks for that, Kate. And then some other ones that have come in, I brought up news articles of the day or week, bridge collapses, water contamination events, look at the news articles, pictures, and then discuss. That's for civil engineering. And then someone from the BISC commented too that meaningful engagement is the premise of BISC pedagogy. Our experiential learning department helps instructors develop ways to take learning beyond the classroom, but also assess that learning. That's great.
That's wonderful. Thank you for bringing up the experiential learning piece.
Yeah, and then they also said at the BISC the classes can be quite small, so they asked the students to take 5 minutes at the end of class to jot down today's takeaways. That's a good approach as well. Not assessed per se, but the instructor can read them and give individual feedback, and then also talk to the class about improving their learning strategies or different ways to approach the material or manage that.
One of the other things I want to mention quickly before we have to wrap up is the process of using peer review and things like ghost grading. One of the things that really helps students focus their attentions the right way are when we offer them feedback quickly in the learning process. And I found a really great way of doing that is with peer review. There's basis in the literature that indicates that imperfect immediate feedback can be just as effective or even sometimes more effective than expert feedback given after the fact or with a large delay. So there are a lot of options for enabling students to read one another's work and use the rubric to give feedback to one another. And what we've discovered is that while teaching is often a solitary activity, being a student is often a solitary activity as well, and they don't often get to read one another's work. And what happens is when students give feedback to one another on their work, they tend to use that critique of other people's work on their own work. And they create a cycle of self-improvement.
Yeah, Kate also mentioned that how peer review is so great for remote delivery because students are looking for connection and feedback, just as you mentioned. Especially in remote delivery, it feels very isolating. It feels there's a disconnect when you're trying to do discussions in front of a computer screen rather than with a group of students and peers. And there's not, especially now during COVID, there's not an opportunity to gather and have study groups physically with each other. So yeah, great ideas for implementation on that.
And the last
needs to head out. So some people are heading out to other meetings. Thank you so much.
Okay. And I'll talk about ghost grading just briefly. Sandra, can you upload the link for people to do the evaluation? And I'll just mention ghost grading. Ghost grading is really quick. It's something where students can hand in assignments as they're writing them. And you or your TAs can give feedback and say, if I was grading this right now, I would give it a C, a B, an A for these reasons. And that's the only feedback you give them, just so that students know if they're on the right track. So it's not a huge chunk of feedback, but it lets students know if they're going in the right direction. There's one last slide that you'll be able to see at the end of this, and it's just the steps in making aligned and transparent assessment, which we covered at the beginning, and it's just sort of a recap. Thank you, everybody. I hope you got at least one thing out of this short webinar that might help you and your students focus on meaningful stuff in your courses.
Yeah. Lots of thank yous rolling in for you, Sue, and we can definitely use any information that you provide to create more resources or provide additional services too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lindsay.